A CBS News inquiry, the Warren Report, continues. Here again is Walter Cronkite.
In addition to the number of shots and the capability of the rifle, it is important to know the time span between shots, since, as we pointed out previously, if the shots were closer together than the rifle could be fired, two rifles must have been involved. So our next question, what was the time span of the shots? The answer might lie in Mr. Zapruder's film of the assassination. You'll recall that the commission decided that the first shot was fired at frame 210 on the Zapruder film, and the last shot at frame 313. Tests of the camera made by the FBI reported that it was running at a speed of 18.3 frames a second. Divide 103 frames by 18.3 frames a second, 5.6 seconds, which is the time the commission reported Oswald probably had to take. It's a point upon which the critics have seized. Could Oswald have fired 3 shots in 5.6 seconds? Well, then new evidence made its appearance. It was the first called to our attention by a distinguished physicist, Dr. Luis Alvarez of the University of California at Berkeley.
What was it that made you interested enough to dip into the Warren Report to begin analyzing the photos of that day?
Well, I think it was probably that I had lunch every day with a bunch of my graduate students who were keenly interested in the controversy that was going on at the time. For a while, I couldn't get very interested in it, but then when Life magazine republished the frames from the Zapruder movie, I spent an evening looking at them, and I found something that excited my interest.
What first caught your eye, Dr. Alvarez?
Well, it's right here in the picture. At frame 227, the highlights on the windshield of the car are all drawn out into rather pronounced streaks. And you can see that in the frame ahead, the highlights are individual dots, and again in the frame beyond, there are individual dots. So something rather violent happened to the line of direction of Mr. Zapruder's camera in frame 227. It swung violently.
If Dr. Alvarez were right, the Zapruder film might contain a record of the number of shots fired. If blurs, which could be accepted as evidence of gunshots, occurred in a certain time span, then the shots themselves would be in the same span. We remind you again that the film is owned by Life magazine and is not available for broadcast. So, CBS News commissioned an expert photo analyst, Charles Wyckoff, of the Massachusetts firm of Edgerton, Germershausen, and Greer, to make an analysis of the Zapruder film frames. Dan Rather interviewed Mr. Wyckoff.
Mr. Wyckoff, the entire Zapruder film shows the whole assassination?
Yes, it does, Dan. The film was an 8mm motion picture film, and the entire record in which the president was in view was represented on a film about this long, which only took about 10 seconds. And all of the records of interest were on this small piece of film. We actually looked at all the frames, but we only studied certain frames in detail. The reason for studying those frames in detail was the fact that there were certain little things in there that looked blurred at first, and we were quite interested in why they looked blurred. For instance, on frame 190 here, or rather, let's start with frame 189, there's a wall in the background with little holes that you can see a white building through those holes.
Well, that's a tile
wall. And you can see the little holes. If you look at it with a magnifying glass here, you see those are nice and round and fairly sharp. And yet in frame 190, right next to it, you can no longer tell that those holes are circular. They're blurred out.
Now, why is that?
Something must have happened to Mr. Zapruder when he was, something must have startled him when he was holding his camera. He had a camera very much like this model right here, which is an 8mm camera. And as he held it up to his eye, concentrating on the president, something startled him, and he jumped a little bit with the camera.
Not nearly that much?
Not anything like that at all, just a very subtle jump, but that was just enough to cause a blur of these little holes in here, and also a blur of highlights on the car.
All right, now you see that very clearly in frame 190, and that frame does look distorted, and you can't see the white holes in the wall across the street clearly at all. Now, how many times does that occur, this 10-second stretch of 8mm film?
Now, that occurs several times, as we've represented up here on this film on the wall. It occurs at frame 190. It occurs again at frame 227. Frame 227 was the next evidence that I had of Mr. Zapruder moving his camera. And it occurs at frame 318. Now, this is interesting because we all know that at frame 313, the president received the fatal shot. He had a natural reaction time that he heard the sound at the time that something happened to President Kennedy when he was fatally wounded here. We can apply this same correction of about 4 or 5 frames to each one of these frames where I noticed motion. In other words, I'm saying that it was possible that there could have been a shot fired here, another one fired in this area of 222, 223, and another one in the area of 313, noticeable now in 318. I think the important thing is the fact that we have found an indication some 20 frames prior to the time the Warren Commission thought that the first shot was fired. Now, whether or not this was a shot, we cannot say, but certainly Mr. Zapruder, the photographer, was disturbed at that point.
What does this finding mean to those of us who simply have followed the controversy over the assassination and are not physicists?
Well, to me it means that there were indeed 3 shots fired, as the commission said, that the one that apparently didn't hit anyone in the car was fired before the one that hit the president, and not between the 2 shots that obviously hit the president.
Just as a rough check on this theory, we decided to try it ourselves using other cameramen holding similar cameras, standing on a rifle range, filming an automobile while a rifleman fired over their heads. These 2 volunteers are aiming their cameras at a parked limousine. Their instructions: hold the cameras as steady as possible and keep filming no matter what happens. The shots will come between them and the car. The cameramen are as far from the firing platform as Mr. Zapruder was from the 6th floor of the book depository. The reaction was obvious. The film taken by these cameramen showed the effect of the shots, despite instructions to hold steady. Even in steadier hands, motion was always noticeable. This frame shows highlight dots around the car's windshield. In reaction to a shot, the dots change to crescents. And in the following frame, they become streaks, comparable to streaks found on some frames of Mr. Zapruder's film. Incidentally, Dr. Alvarez also suggested that the first shot might still be lodged in the tree. We checked it with a metal detector, but unfortunately it did not reveal any presence of a bullet. Perhaps more sophisticated equipment will be developed in the future to X-ray the tree.